Hello, this is a review, so I'm going to talk a little fast. And if I'm still not going fast enough for you, if you're on YouTube, you can skip ahead. You can also, with any YouTube video, you can tell it to play faster and maybe sound like a chipmunk, and that's okay. But this is to cover the major perspectives of psychology. And so let's go ahead and get started here. This is a review. So these are the perspectives I'm going to cover right now. And this is stuff that you kind of already know, and maybe there's something you don't know, but let's go ahead and get started here. So, psychodynamic or psychoanalytic goes back to the theories of Sigmund Freud. These guys are all about the unconscious mind. So they talk about the childhood experiences and how they've affected us in in our current situation. Everything is always about the unconscious mind and your repressed memories and how they affect us even today. This also goes back to part of now in the personality chapter. It goes back to the id, ego, superego. I don't want to get into that. I'm just trying to refresh your memory. Defense mechanisms. You need to know these for the AP exam, but these are Freudian defense mechanisms. There are 9 defense mechanisms. Don't forget overcompensation, which was not from Sigmund Freud. Now, therapy, psychoanalysis is all about the couch. You lay down on the couch and you start talking about whatever free association, you start talking about whatever comes to mind. And then the therapist, the psychoanalyst, will sit there and take notes and interpret what you say as a clue to your unconscious mind. That's psychoanalysis. Hopefully, there isn't too much of that going on nowadays, but it's still a thing. So remember free association. I just mentioned that. Dream analysis. Don't want to get into that. Don't forget, Freud thought that your dreams were a form of wish fulfillment. So if you dream about something, that means that you wish that would happen. Okay. Transference is more of a goal in psychotherapy. You have this emotional outburst, and supposedly this is you're projecting something about yourself onto your therapist. Hypnosis, it gets into the unconscious mind. So, in summary, psychoanalysis or the psychodynamic perspective is all about getting into the unconscious mind. Okay. And in personality assessment, rather than doing a self report personality inventory, they might use the TAT test or the ink blot test to access your unconscious mind. So tell me what you're looking at here. That psychoanalyst would take what you say and use that as a clue to get into your unconscious mind. Okay. And a motivation in the motivation chapter, another form of the thematic apperception test, the TAT test. Give me a story. Tell me what's going on here. Well, that might give somebody a clue to your achievement motivation. Is the older guy ragging on the younger guy, or is the older guy giving constructive criticism? That would be a way to find out what your achievement motivation is. Okay? So, criticize Freud's theory. Basically, you can hit pause, but basically, it's not scientific. He didn't do experiments. It seems like he just made this stuff up. I mean, I'm not saying that he's all wrong, but he's not a scientist, and his sample sizes were very limited. Basically, rich Jews in Austria who could afford to see him. So it's a self selected sample. It's not a random sample from the general population. He didn't study Latinos, he didn't study Japanese or anything. He just studied people who came to him. Okay, that's not how you formulate theories in the scientific world. And his ideas were very sexist and very sex obsessed. That's another problem with Sigmund Freud. So this is kind of a joke, but Freud said that we are all obsessed with sex. Okay, maybe he's right, maybe he's wrong, but you can't just say that without backing it up with science. Okay, now he did do some good things. Childhood experiences do affect us as adults. His defense mechanisms were good. Now, we're not so sure about the unconscious mind, but information outside of our awareness does influence us. Okay. Now, moving on to another perspective, behaviorism. The behaviorists come along. Pavlov was in the early 1900s. John Watson, with his little Albert experiment, was in the 20s. Skinner will come along in the 40s and the 50s. And this perspective says that the psychoanalysts were garbage. They come along and say that the psychoanalysts were unscientific, which they were. Behaviorists will bring science back into psychology, even though if they overdo it a little bit. Behaviorists are not interested in the unconscious mind since it cannot be observed in a laboratory. They say that if it cannot be observed in a laboratory, then it's not science. Okay, fair enough. Hit pause and read this quote, but this is by John Watson, the famous behaviorist who did the little Albert experiment, the little baby Albert. Thorndike, not too important, but he locked a cat up into this puzzle box, and he found that the cat could find its way out of the puzzle box if it was rewarded with food to do so. He called that the law of effect. His name was Thorndike, Edward Thorndike. Pavlov, he studied classical conditioning. Even though he wasn't a scientist, he was a physiologist. He studied classical conditioning, and the idea, he famously trained a dog to drool to a bell. And you want to be very familiar with all of that, but I'm just trying to review you the different perspectives. Ivan Pavlov was a behaviorist. Okay. Make sure you know all this stuff, the UCS, UCR, and all that, but I'm just reviewing you behaviorism right now. Skinner comes along and he's famous for operant conditioning. Operant conditioning is rewards and punishments. He put these pigeons in what are called operant chambers, also called Skinner boxes, and he measured schedules of reinforcement with the pigeons. And he wanted to know, if you trained a pigeon to do something, is it better? Which schedule of reinforcement would be the best? So make sure you know all that, but not right now. Behaviorism also includes Albert Bandura, who's famous for the Bobo doll experiment. And he said basically, monkey see, monkey do. If we serve as a model for our kids, we also serve as a model for our friends. So that's true with a lot of behaviors, eating disorders, depression, littering, all that stuff could be copied from the people around us. So the behavioral perspective can explain why people get addicted to gambling. You could say variable ratio schedule, positive reinforcement. Why don't students wear their ID badge? Maybe it's the rewards of the adrenaline rush. Why won't that boy or why won't that girl call you anymore? Well, how was that girl or boy rewarded for calling you? Did you just complain all the time? Were you pleasant? In the absence of rewards, behaviors do get extinguished. Okay, we actually call that extinction. Okay. In therapy, there are all kinds of behavioral therapies. There's token economy used in clinics, like eating disorder clinics, for example, or other kinds of other addiction clinics. If you go to group therapy every day, you get up and you participate in therapy, then you get points. We call that token economy. Systematic desensitization for phobias and OCD type behaviors. That is a behavioral therapy. Okay. Aversion therapy or aversive conditioning. If you can use classical conditioning to get you to stop doing a behavior like drinking alcohol, that's a behavioral therapy. Okay. So in summary, Behaviorism says we do what we do because of conditioning, and we have very little free will, that we are just a product of our environment. Okay, that's a bit extreme, but that's how behaviorists believe. They do believe that you have some free will to control your environment, though. Not a lot, though. All right, so multiple choice. Which of the following approaches to psychology emphasizes observable responses over inner experiences when accounting for behavior? That is a behaviorist. Okay. Which of the following statements is true of behaviorism? The answer is, hit pause if you need to. The answer is D. All right, learning, D. Now, moving on to humanism. Okay. Humanism they come along in the 60s, and they're a little touchy-feely, but they really do change therapy forever. And it's not just therapy. We also run into them in the personality chapter, and we run into them in the motivation chapter. Humanists, they throw out the couch. They say therapy should not be therapist-centered, but it should be client-centered. Okay? Hit pause and read all of that, but they focus on human potential and free will. We're not pigeons in a cage, man. We're human beings, man. Maslow and his hierarchy of needs. Make sure you vaguely have that memorized, especially self-actualization. Self-actualization is basically maximizing your potential. Carl Rogers comes along and he changes therapy forever. He says therapists need to be empathetic, they need to do active listening. Then also, therapists need to have unconditional, positive regard for their clients. It's kind of like unconditional love, but more therapeutic, more professional. In the personality chapter, we talked about what is our real self? What is our ideal self? If our real self and our ideal self don't match, he called that neurosis. Carl Rogers did. If they are totally far apart, he called that the shattered self. But if your real and your ideal self match pretty much almost 100%, Carl Rogers calls this congruence, and he calls this a fully functioning individual. So Abraham Maslow said that this was self-actualization. Carl Rogers calls this fully functioning individual. It's what we're all trying to achieve. So basically, it's kind of touchy-feely, but it is a very important part of psychology. Positive psychology comes from humanism as well. That's a real interesting field of psychology. It talks about like the scientific study of what makes us happy, what makes us good, productive human beings. That's positive psychology. Cognitive psychology. Okay, think about the word cognitive, thinking. Okay, think about the word recognition. There's the word cognition in there. It's the study of how people perceive, remember, think, speak, and solve problems. It does include memory. And cognitive therapy is about changing the maladaptive thoughts of a person. So this is just a summary. Cognitive psychologist. There was a memory psychologist named Alan Baddeley, and he studied memory. He's famous for his model for working memory, short-term memory. Okay. Piaget was a cognitive developmental psychologist. He studied children using naturalistic observation. So Piaget was a cognitive developmental psychologist. Elizabeth Loftus was a cognitive psychologist. She studied how memories can be reconstructive and that they are not perfect. The fallibility of eyewitness testimony. And in therapy, you've got some really good therapies. Like what causes depression? Your maladaptive thoughts. How do you treat depression? Change your maladaptive thoughts. So you've got Aaron Beck, Albert Ellis. Albert Ellis founded rational emotive therapy. Aaron Beck and William Glasser are famous for reality therapy. And these are very common in modern day therapy. Cognitive therapy is very common. They do mix it in with a little bit of humanism, but it's very common in therapy today. Okay, here's a book by William Glasser called Reality Therapy. It wouldn't kill you to read it. It's not a bad book. I haven't read it, but I have read a book by Albert Ellis. Okay, he has a lot of good books, and I highly recommend reading one of his books. All right, evolutionary psychology. Okay, so how have human beings changed over the last million years? How do the human beings from the grasslands of Africa, how are we similar even today? That's the evolutionary perspective. Survival of the fittest. Okay, so it examines psychological traits such as memory, perception, or language from a modern evolutionary perspective. It seeks to identify which human psychological traits are evolved adaptations, that is, the functional products of natural selection or sexual selection. Okay? So it gets you to think about some things, you know? Um, like, why do women usually prefer the guy on the right? Ladies, check out these two guys. Most of you prefer the guy on the right. And evolutionary psychologists would try to figure out why. Okay. Why do men like large breasts? There is a reason for that. Okay. An evolutionary reason for that. Okay. Why do men have a better sense of direction? Why do women have a better language skills? Okay. And you get into a lot of triggery gender and sexual differences, but it's a really interesting topic. Brain Games has two really good episodes called The Battle of the Sexes. I highly recommend you look them up. The Battle of the Sexes. Okay. Why do women spend so much money on a weekly basis at the store, but men will surprise their wives with a brand new car without asking her? Men always complain about women spending a lot of money, but men will go out and spend $700 on a PS4. Okay. Um, Evolutionary psychologists try to explain this behavior with comparisons to hunter gatherer cultures. Maybe our shopping differences go back to the way we hunted. Men would go hunt the big game, women would go and pick berries and fruits and nuts. Why do women have more bug phobias? Maybe it all goes back to evolutionary psychology. This is a film that I usually show in class. I highly recommend it. It's called Science of Sex Appeal. And if you look at the YouTube Discovery Channel, there's a lot of clips from it. I bought the whole film for $5 on Amazon, and I usually show the first hour of it. It's a really great film. I'm very interested in all this. And it's very much evolutionary psychology. Why do we find each other attractive, and why do we not find each other attractive? Very interesting topic. And then the biological or the biomedical perspective. Now, it's not just pills, but that is the most common form of therapy. Okay. Um, these guys are the most respected right now. They focus on our brain, our nervous system, neurotransmitters, and our hormones to explain our behaviors. Okay. So, love is simply oxytocin in your brain. Fear is adrenaline and norepinephrine. And depression is caused by an imbalance of neurotransmitters. That's the biological perspective. Surgeries are rare. In the old days, you would have the lobotomy where they'd stick an ice pick up your eyelid and mess with your frontal lobe. We don't really do those anymore. This is also extremely rare, but cut the corpus callosum to keep seizures from spreading from one side of your brain to the other. Okay, those are rare too, but they happen. And when that happens, you get split brain. These are very expensive, but these are legit biomedical therapies. Electroconvulsive therapy is a form of biomedical therapy where they put you down, with an anesthesiologist, and then they shock certain parts of your brain and they simulate a seizure while you're down, and they also give you muscle relaxers. And from what I have heard, this therapy works, but it's expensive. And the only side effect is memory loss. So that is a biomedical therapy. Another one is TMS, transcranial magnetic stimulation. And this is really good for schizophrenics because it really helps get rid of the voices. So this is an option to pills. Now, I'm not saying pills are bad. I'm just saying that it's a very expensive option. These are some common medicines that normally you would need to know for the AP exam. Okay. All right, so the rest is just multiple choice. A cognitive psychologist would be most likely interested in what? Hit pause if you want, that's the space bar. Look for something along the lines of thinking. And the answer in this case would be D, perceptual speed. That's your brain working. How fast can you think? Okay. The humanistic approach to psychology emphasizes the importance of, okay, so which one of these sounds the most hippie, the most touchy-feely? The answer is D, free will and conscious awareness. Okay? We're free, man. We're not pigeons in a cage, man. Psychologists who emphasize the importance of repressed memories and childhood experiences subscribe to which perspective? All right, repressed memories, that means you press it down into the unconscious. So the answer is C, psychodynamic. Which of the following best summarizes classic behaviorism? The best answer is A, punishments and rewards. External, the environment. Okay. To which perspective are the roles of knowledge, information processing, and their interactions most central? Okay, that sounds like memory and thinking, so I'm going to go with B, cognitive. Sigmund Freud was the founder of which of the following perspectives in psychology? The answer is D, psychoanalytic, psychodynamic. A psychologist who believes in the humanistic perspective would be most likely to agree with which of the following statements? Okay, look for something that's very touchy-feely, kind of hippie. The answer is B, free will. You have the freedom to be all that you can be, to maximize your potential, to self-actualize. B.F. Skinner was well known for his work involving the what perspective? Okay, Skinner, pigeons in a Skinner box. The answer is B, behavioral. Dream analysis would be part of which perspective? The answer is C, psychoanalytic, psychodynamic. Evolutionary theory predicts that women should place more emphasis than men on all but which of the following partner characteristics? Okay, so we're talking about women here. And whether you like it or not, the answer is C. Not a very an easy question, but status is number one for women. Attractiveness is important, but that's not quite as attractive. Okay? Remember, status goes with wealth and being funny. Being funny is status too. That is it. Hope that was useful to you.